Hey everybody, and welcome back to the channel, and today we are talking about the VCT 2024 format that was announced today. So Riot announced what the format for next season of the VCT is going to look like right ahead of the top 4 of Champions 2023. This was announced just ahead of the top 4 of Champions 2023, which will be starting tomorrow. We are talking about what this format is it better than the one that happened this year in 2023, and will it be better from both an audience perspective and a player perspective? So if we look at this image here, this was the image that was put in the video that they made about it, which explained the whole format. And as you can see, it explains how each tier of the Valorant competitive scene is going to work. So we have the International, which is obviously the top tier with all the VCT 3 leagues, the Pacific, EMEA, and Americas. Then we have Challengers, which is the tier 2 scene, and then we have Premier, which is the in-game, more than competitive kind of thing. It's like a league that you can play in yourself. You just, make up a team with your friends. I'm not explaining the whole thing right now. If you've played Valorant, you know what this is, at least if you played Valorant recently. So for the International League, the year will start off yet again with a kickoff tournament, which will include every team, but this time it will be locked to just the 3 leagues, so each league will have their own tournament, instead of lock-in, which was all 30 teams from this league being in all-in-one tournament, which granted was a great tournament, but there were a lot of problems with that tournament format-wise, at least with what the players had, and it being a single elimination tournament wasn't as good as what we're used to now, where it's double elimination, and what VCT has worked like for most of its existence, having double elimination brackets in the VCT games. Sometimes there's been single elimination here and there, like in playoff stages. I believe Champs 2021 had a single elimination playoff bracket, whereas groups were double elimination. Doesn't matter. People didn't like it, and now we are seeing a kickoff tournament, which I assume is going to be double elimination. And while many people had a problem with the format of the lock-in tournament, I understood why they did it the way that they did. When you have a tournament with 30 teams, that's a lot of teams to go through. So if they did double elimination for the tournament, that tournament would have lasted basically a month or over a month, whereas it lasted about 3 weeks, and that's still a long time for a tournament. So if you want to have a tournament that showcases all of your brand new teams in this brand new franchise league, I understood why they did it in the way that they did, because it wouldn't have really worked if it was double elimination, because it would have just lasted way too long. And then you have players in Brazil for a very long time, and it just would have not really been great, and it probably would have delayed the rest of the season. So they did it the way they did it, but I do not believe that the kickoff tournament in the 2024 season is going to work the same way. It's probably going to be double elimination. But either way, that kickoff tournament will lead into Valorant Masters Madrid. It's going to be in Spain this time. So we won't have a regular season stage before the first Masters. I assumed that was how it was going to work, but they decided to keep these kickoff tournaments and just have them be within each respective league. So I understand why they're doing that, and now there are international stages, at least regular season stages is what I refer to them as, both after Madrid and then after Valorant Masters Shanghai, which is the second Masters of the year. And of course, we will have Valorant Champions in August, and then Valorant Game Changers Championship will be in November. I'm kind of curious as to why that's in the international tier. I guess, I don't know if that counts as tier 1 Game Changers. I guess in this format it does, but I do understand why Champions is there, because it is an international tournament, and they weren't going to have another bracket for Game Changers, I guess. So here it is, just placed in the International League. But Game Changers is an absolutely fantastic tournament, and it has a very good Valorant with some very, very talented players. And we'll get to more about Game Changers later, because there is some changes that are coming to how the players are treated in respective to the other leagues. And then the Challengers League will work very similarly to how it did this year, but this time it's going to be throughout the entire year. So we're going to have Challengers going on year-round. The first split will be in February and then ends in April. The second split will be in May and then ends in August. And then the Ascension Tournament will be after Valiant Champions this year, which I do think is better. I think it's good if you're going to have this Tier 2 scene and have it be at the same time as most of the regular international franchise league tournaments, then I think it's best to have your big finale of that Challengers be after the Champions, after the big showcase of the Tier 1 teams. So I think that's a decent change here. There also is another Challengers split right after that, which does seem like these Challengers teams are going to have their work cut out for them. There's going to be a lot of Valorant to be played from these teams. And of course, we have the Premier League, which again, I'm not going to get too much into, but you have the split, and then there's a promotion tournament, and another split promotion tournament. It's basically a way for random players just sitting at home can have a chance to actually showcase their abilities to teams. So that can probably be a good way for teams and management of teams to scout players and for players to really make a name for themselves if they haven't been given the chance by a tier 1 or tier 2 team. So I think that this is a pretty cool thing that Valorant is doing here with the Premier League, and I think more games are going to start to emulate this kind of format. So that is the entire format right there, and I'm going to go through my notes now just under. So as you may have seen and may have noticed, there is no LCQ, and the kickoff tournaments are now regional, as I mentioned, but the no LCQ is very interesting. LCQ has been in every year of the VCT so far, so having it being completely taken out for an international regular season stage is quite an interesting change. Now, I don't personally know the reactions to this bit of info specifically, but personally, I think that this is a good change. The LCQ, I do think it's always a fun tournament. It always has some good Valorant going on, but the problem with it is that this is these teams' last chance to get into the last tournament of the year. And since it's in a double elimination bracket instead of how the international regular season stages work, which is just you play every team and then you do a tournament, I do think it is better to have that be the last chance that you have to get into champions versus just doing another double elimination tournament, which also sometimes has a finicky format that teams and players may not like. For example, the LCQs that happened this year, the very first 2 matches, which were like the bottom teams of the league, those were single elimination, and then the next ones were double elimination, which I thought was weird. I didn't really understand why that was, but they did it, and it's just kind of a wonky format. So I do think having a regular season stage will give us more games and more Valorant to watch and more interesting Valorant to watch and see how it's interesting to see how teams evolve over a season format versus just one tournament where it's, teams can come out of nowhere and then be really good and then just get a lucky bracket, or teams that are really good can get a very tough bracket or vice versa, where I think it's better to see how a team evolves, how their performance improves and evolves over a season versus just one tournament, because that's what I think the Masters and Champions should be reserved for. So personally, I do like this change. I do kind of wish that there was a regular season stage instead of a kickoff tournament at the start, but the kickoff tournament should be fun to watch, so who's to say? And another big change that has come to the VCT is the addition of championship points. So what are the championship points? Well, basically, this is the VCT's new format and new way of deciding which teams qualify for the international tournaments. So teams will earn points based off of performance. More points are earned as the year goes on and the events get more and more high stakes. And qualifications for international tournaments, Masters, and Champions are based off of the most recent performance of the team and the amount of championship points you have. Now, this is a very interesting format, and I think this is to kind of curve stuff that happened to teams like Cloud9. Cloud9, they were dominant throughout the entire regular season. They had a decent performance at Lock, and they did win one match against Paper X, then lost immediately after. But then they had a really good regular season, which people didn't really expect. But they were dominant, and then they just have a terrible playoffs, and then they don't win an LCQ, and they were not at one of the international tournaments this year. Now, if you have championship points, and if they had it this year, based off of their performance, they probably would have made it in to at least one of the tournaments this year. And what Riot said in the format explainer video was that this was to make teams both have to play really good in the moment and then consistently good. So it rewards teams based off of the play throughout the entire year and at the end of the year or at the end of whatever stage they're at. Now, depending on how you look at this could be either good or bad. And I think that there is a chance for this to be really helpful for some teams, but also screw over some other teams. As I said, teams like Cloud9, they can have a really good performance all regular season and then just completely bomb out in the playoffs, and then they're just not in any of the international tournaments this year, which they probably should have been. And you can make the argument that these championship points can make it more fair for those teams, because if they're just dominating all year and then they just lose 2 matches in playoffs, then they're just out and they don't get another chance, even though they were very good early in the year. That doesn't seem totally fair. But at the same time, you can make the argument that, well, you have to show up in those big moments. And if you don't show up in those big moments, why should you be the ones to make it to those international tournaments versus teams that maybe didn't have a good start in the regular season, but then dominated when it really mattered? Evil Geniuses comes to mind with that one. So it kind of just depends on how you look at it. I think it could go either way. It could be good or bad. We'll see what happens with it. We'll see if some teams get screwed over because one team just had a great regular season and then lost in the playoffs, but then because of the point system, they make it in versus a team that maybe had a slow start and was good later on. We'll see if stuff like that happens. That is my concern with it, but I do think that these championship points will be a good way to determine which teams make it in. And another big change is the player loan system that is coming to the VCT. Teams can now borrow players from challenger and game changer teams. It is a player loan system, as I said, so it hasn't been fully fleshed out, at least in the format video, but basically there will be a more streamlined way for tier 1 teams to get players from the tier 2 scene and have it be a more free-flowing, kind of like how in any sport, teams have farm teams or whatever, and then they can call up players from the minor leagues and then have them play at the big leagues, and then they maybe send them back down or keep them back on the roster. It's basically going to be something like that, but maybe in a more complicated way, because esports just likes to make its formats and player team compositions complicated, like Valorant. Like in the VCT, you couldn't make changes to your roster after a certain point, which is fine, and I think that does do a good job protecting players from just being dropped like that. But it also means that if there's situations where the team's just not doing good at all, or something happens to some player, then you're just screwed because you can't add another player. So I do think if there's a better loan system, then that could be a good way to curve that and also give players a better chance. So I think that this is a good change. As previously mentioned, the Ascension tournament is now after Champions. Challengers is now year-round. We'll see how this goes. I'm interested to see how a year-round Challengers split goes. Is it going to completely burn out players by the end of the year? Are teams just going to give up halfway through the year? And, if a team's financial situation just completely goes belly up, which happens a lot in esports, are they just going to not be able to compete? Then those players are just left hung and dry. It could be good and it could be bad. We'll see what happens. And the biggest news, which I should probably have in bigger letters, but China has been added as the 4th VCT league, and it has now been officially announced. This was the rumor all year, and Chinese teams were being added to the international tournaments to kind of tease this change, or at least to keep these teams within the VCT but not have them as their own actual league, because China's very complicated to have these kind of things in it, and Valorant hadn't even launched in China at a certain point, but it is now launching, and I believe already has launched in China. So now we will have a VCT China League. We'll see how it goes. I think it's going to have some great competition. We've seen some China teams be very good in Masters and in Champions. EDG obviously comes to mind. So we'll see how this goes, but I think it'll be good to grow the game to a more international level, and I do think it's great to have more teams in Asia, because this game absolutely has potential to really pull in a really big market from places like Korea, Japan, China. So we'll see how this goes. I hope it goes well. And Champions will have the top 4 teams from each league. I believe that is based off of mainly points, but also I guess because of the latest performance thing. This format might get a little complicated at times throughout the year. We'll see how it goes. But basically, it is the top 4 teams from each region, the top 16 teams of the league. So I'm very curious to see how that goes, because in this one, it was top 3 made it after the regular season playoffs, and then LCQ added another, and then those teams were also invited to Champions, but it also had to be the LCQ teams as the 4th team. So I think it still evens out to be the same amount of teams. And the offseason, yet again, is nearly 6 months, which I think is a big problem for this current iteration of the VCT. It's too long. It's just straight up too long. You don't need to have this long of a break for an esport. I do think that it does hurt the numbers of Valorant having this long of a break. I know they have off-season stuff, and now that they have the Ascension tournament taking place after Champions and also another Challenger split after that, as well as Game Changers. They have all these third-party tournaments going on as the off-season. I get it. I understand that they have all these extra events that they want to do and they want time for them. But the problem is, when you have your Tier 1 teams off for so long, they'll get cold. They'll maybe get disinterested and players will want to move on to a different game, but then they're locked in these contracts. You'll have other games come up in popularity and be much more popular than Valorant at the time and maybe steal that spotlight from them. Counter-Strike 2 coming out very soon, presumably, so that absolutely will steal a spotlight from Valorant. And if they do it, if they release it during the off-season of Valorant, which it looks like they're going to, that could pull a lot of players back. And because they have such a long off-season, it's going to probably bring viewers towards CS2 and other games as well. It didn't seem to hurt the VCT too much last season when they had a long off-season, but almost 6 months is just too long. Regular sports leagues will have, a little bit less than 6 months as a break, depending on the sport. It varies between sports and whatnot. But for the main one that I watch, which is hockey, it's about 4 months-ish. So it's just a long time, and I do think that it can kill Valorant's momentum a little bit. And also, players, the reaction so far to it has not been great. A lot of them disliking this new format change. A lot of them saying that you haven't listened to the teams. We said we wanted more rest. We didn't want this long off-season after this huge grind of a season. This is not what we wanted. I understand where the players are coming from for this, but I have two different angles from it. First, it is quite a jam-packed amount of Valorant in a short amount of time. That's kind of the problem with it. The reason why the off-season is as long as it is because the main Tier 1 season ends in August. It starts in February, though. So whereas hockey will start from October for the regular season, then go all the way till April for the regular season, and then playoffs ends in June, usually. And then you have the rest of the summer off. Whereas this, it's just like a grind for 6 months, and then Champions, which is 7 months if you get in. So they could really just move Champions like a month or two, maybe have it in October. I know they had it in December one year, but maybe have it in September, October, one of the fall months, and then just make the stages last longer, make there be more time in between masters. I do think that there is room for them to move around, but there are reasons why Riot has it at the times that they do. Part of it is, as I said, the off-season tournaments, that the third-party tournaments that Riot has, and part of it is also because Riot owns League of Legends, and League of Legends, their Worlds ends in November. So if you have two of your top games pretty much going head-to-head in terms of, viewership, that isn't always helpful to both of them, especially when the end of the season before the big tournaments, before Champions and Worlds, those are usually the very high stakes regular season gameplay going on. So if you have that kind of clashing against each other, I can see why they wouldn't want to do that. My counter argument would be League and Valorant are two very different games. One is a tactical shooter, one is a MOBA, and as a person who likes FPSs, I could not give less of a shit about League and MOBAs. I'm sorry. I'm sure League is a great esport if you understand it, but every time I look at gameplay of League of Legends, I cannot understand what is happening on my screen. I just can't. It's just colors. That's all I see. But I'm sure for those that understand it, it's a very great esport. But I do think that the audiences do overlap, but maybe not as much as we may think. But at the same time, I'm not at Riot. I don't have their statistics. I don't have their marketing strategy. So this is what they have. And that's probably part of the reason why. And again, players in these leagues have spoken out against this format and the format last year. It was a big point of discussion last year as well, where a lot of players felt burnt out. A lot of it felt like it was just an insane amount of grinding and prep and all this stuff going on for such a short amount of time, and then just have this super long off season. They wanted more time to prep for matches and more time for rest, and then have a shorter off season so that they're just not, just sitting there cold and just trying to figure out like how their team's going to look like for this huge amount of time without actually seeing this team in regular competition. Now, I don't mean to make this comparison to dismiss the amount of work that these players put in, or that it's not actually as tiring as they say it is, because I'm sure it is. It's a lot of work to be a pro esports player, but I do just want to bring up that regular sports, those players in Major League Baseball, they play over 100 games. In hockey, they play 82. I believe it's also 82 in the NBA. And now there's also a kickoff tournament for the NBA as well. That's a new thing. Football players do play less. They only play 16, but that is one of the most physically demanding sports. So I understand why it's such a short season, because like people just get concussions left and right there. You don't want them to get, even more concussions. But if you compare it to how these regular sports do it, it could be seen as, well, these players are just kind of complaining a lot. And I'm not saying that they are. I'm saying that they're unjustified in what they're saying. But at a certain point, it's like, we need this league to work. If we want this league to have really good competition, to keep the audience engaged, it's good to have a regular season that does last a decent amount of time. And yes, it is, tough to play every week. At the same time, it's like, you're just playing once a week, and you usually have a week to prepare against whatever team. Someone argued that that's a fine amount. Someone argued that that's a perfectly fine amount of time to prepare. So there's different angles to look at it from. I'm somewhere in the middle of, I do think players do have to make the compromises and should maybe think about that a bit more, and why Riot is doing what it's doing, because it's never going to be perfect. The format of the VCT has been much discussed since its inception, and it's going to continue being a point of discussion. And I don't think that we're going to reach a place where this format is perfect for both players and viewership. I think this schedule is great for viewership. I mean, you can watch professional Valorant at pretty much any time of the year with this new schedule, and the regular season of the international tournament sounds like it's going to be a lot of fun, and that's a good amount of Valorant to watch for that entire February to August. So Riot, yes, is prioritizing the viewership aspect of it more than the players and their comfortability, and I completely understand that is not fun and that does suck, but unfortunately it's just kind of how it goes. And playing once a week, I do think that is at least more reasonable than playing, twice a week or 3 times a week. It was twice a week for Super Week for each of the leagues, but most of the time it was just 1 match a week. Again, I understand these players put in a lot of work. It is probably very tiring, and it is probably a lot of work. But at some point, you got to say, we have to keep the competition going. And if we have games just way too far apart, then maybe viewers won't be as interested in the teams or the players that they once really liked. So there's a lot of angles to look at it from. And again, I just don't think that there's going to be a perfect VCT format at any point. I don't think any of the formats of regular sports leagues are perfect. I don't think the format for most esports is perfect or like good enough at all. So I do think that this is at the very least a decent format. I do think it is quite tasking for the players, and there is a lot going on. I do think that this is going to be great for viewership, and I think it's going to create some very good Valorant throughout the entire season. So let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Do you think that this format change is for the better? Do you think it's going to be good? Do you think it's going to be bad? Do you think the championship points are going to be a good addition or a bad addition? Is the player loan system going to be good? Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below, as always. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!